Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, where forgotten American history comes alive. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from the past that still echoes today in the lonely hollows of the Appalachian Mountains. A father and daughter lived in silence. In that silence, something unspeakable grew. And from that silence came the most sinister daughter the mountains ever remembered, asterisk. In the deep folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where the morning mist hangs like a shroud over the hollers and the ridges echo with the lonely cry of whippoorwills, there once was a story that no preacher dared to speak from the pulpit, and no schoolteacher would write upon a slate. It was whispered instead on porches. Late at night, when the fireflies lit the yards and the old folks sat rocking with their pipes and their jars of homebrew, they would lower their voices and glance into the dark woods, as though fearing the shadows might carry the tale to ears that should not hear it. The story they told was not about heroes or outlaws, or even the rough tragedies of mining and moonshine. It was darker than all of that, a tale of family ties twisted so tightly they strangled the very soul of a people. Old folks would begin with the land, because the land itself was always the first character in mountain stories. These mountains were beautiful but cruel. A man could plow his little patch of soil for a whole season, and still his children might go hungry when the crop failed. The winters were hard, the summers full of storms, and the long isolation meant that families leaned only upon one another for survival. That closeness was both their strength and their curse, for when the world narrowed to nothing but kin and cabin and hillside, a body could forget the wider laws that governed other folks. Lives the mountains made their own rules, and sometimes those rules bent into shapes that could no longer be called right. It was in one such hollow, a narrow crease in the earth where the sunlight only spilled for a few hours a day, that a man named Eli was said to have raised his family. Eli was no different from many mountain men. He was gaunt and weathered, with a beard that grew wild, and eyes that seemed always to be searching the tree line as if expecting some danger to break through. He worked the land with his hands, cut timber when neighbors called on him, and hunted in the thick woods for deer and bear to keep meat on the table. Folks said he had once been a strong and decent man, but the war had taken something from him. Which war, they never agreed. Some said it was the Spanish War. Others said it was the Great War that sent him overseas to the trenches. Whichever it was, he came back quieter, harder, and with a shadow that followed him everywhere. He had a wife, Mary, who bore his children and kept the cabin warm through all the lean years together. They had 3 sons and a daughter, and though their life was poor, it was a life of endurance like so many others. But Mary sickened before her time. The mountains were full of sicknesses that swept through hollows and left families ruined. Consumption, some called it coughing sickness, others whispered of curses. She wasted away over one long winter, and by the time spring peepers sang again, Eli was left alone with the children. The sons grew wild and restless, working in the fields when they had to, but vanishing into the hills with rifles and dogs whenever they could. The daughter was different. She stayed by the cabin, helped cook and clean, tended to the smaller boys, and even sat with her father in the evenings when the loneliness hung heavy over the room. Her name was Ruth, and though she was plain in the face, with dark hair and a thin figure, she carried a quiet strength that drew the eyes of all who saw her, who the neighbors remembered most when they whispered the tale. Ruth, who walked barefoot along the creek beds with buckets of water. Ruth, who mended the boys' shirts by the light of a single oil lamp. Ruth, who sang old hymns in a soft, trembling voice as she worked. When Mary died, Ruth was still barely a woman, and yet the weight of the household fell upon her. She cooked Eli's meals, washed his clothes, and listened when he spoke in the low, slow voice that came from deep inside his chest. They said at first it was pity that bound her to him, a daughter's pity for a father broken by loss and by war. They said she was his comfort when the nights grew long and the wolves howled from the ridge. But comfort in those hills was a dangerous thing. It could slip from tenderness into something far heavier and far more damning. The neighbors began to notice odd things. Ruth was seldom seen at church after Mary's passing. Eli kept her close, always close to close some thought when the boys went off into the woods. It was Eli and Ruth who remained behind, working side by side in the garden, or sitting together. In the cabin doorway, when other young men from the hollow called at the gate, Eli turned them away with a hard stare, and Ruth never protested, they said. She even lowered her eyes, as if ashamed or afraid, and when her body began to change, when her belly rounded beneath her simple dresses, folks turned their heads and did not speak of it. For who was there to blame? No outsider had been near enough, and no cousin from another hollow had come courting. The only man who shared her roof was Eliby. Then whispers filled the hollow, whispers that clung to the air like smoke. No one asked Ruth directly, but all could see the truth in the curve of her body and the look in Eli's eyes. Some said he walked straighter, prouder, even as the shame grew. Others said he became more silent, more guarded, as though daring anyone to question him. The preacher in the little clapboard church spoke one Sunday on scenes that defiled both flesh and spirit, and his voice shook with fury, but he never named Eli. Not outright, for to name him would be to start a war in the hollow, and no one had the courage for that, so the people did what mountain people often did when faced with a thing too terrible to confront. They turned away, they let the silence cover it like snow covers a grave. When the baby came, it was born in secret behind the cabin walls. Ruth labored with only Eli by her side, and the midwife was never called, some said. The child died at birth and was buried at the edge of the woods. Others claimed they saw a tiny figure swaddled in cloth rocking on the cabin porch weeks later. But whether that child lived or died, it was not that last. Ruth bore, for the years rolled on, and her body swelled again and again. Neighbors counted not one, but several children, all born under Eli's roof, all hidden from the wider world. They grew pale and sickly. Some said their faces bore a strangeness that made folks uneasy. Perhaps it was only gossip. Perhaps it was the cruel imagination of a people who had already judged Eli and Ruth. But the story spread from hollow to hollow until it became part of the mountains. Lore, a tale of a daughter who bore her own father's children. Yet what made the story cling like burrs was not only the horror of the sin, but the way it was told, with sorrow as well as disgust. Some old women would shake their heads and say, Ruth never had a choice, they said. She was trapped in that hollow with a father who had lost his wife and his mind, and that she endured because there was no escape. Others said she was complicit, that she clung to him out of some twisted loyalty or fear of the outside world. Still others argued it was the mountains themselves that birthed such a fate, the isolation, the poverty, the heavy silence of the ridges pressing in until right and wrong no longer had their shape. Story of Ruth, the most sinister daughter of the mountains, became a kind of warning told to young girls who dreamed of wandering too far from their families. It was told to boys as a lesson in the dangers of letting hunger for control or comfort twist into tyranny. It was told and retold, each time changing shape a little, but always carrying that same weight, that same chill that settled in the chest when the fire burned low and the night closed in. For in the Appalachian Mountains, the line between folklore and truth was always thin and apps. And this story walked that line so closely, no one could say where memory ended and legend began. The hollow where Eli's cabin once stood is overgrown. Now trees rise where the corn once struggled to grow, and moss clings to the stones of the chimney. Some say, if you walk there at dusk, you can hear a woman's voice singing a hymn, soft and sorrowful, drifting through the trees as though carried on the wind. Others say you might see small shapes moving among the shadows, children's shapes, but not quite right, not quite whole. And though no one dares to stay long in that place, all agree that the land itself remembers that it holds the secret tight, the way the mountains hold every secret pressed deep into their ancient bones. That is where the tale begins, with Eli, the broken man, with Ruth, the daughter, who bore more than any daughter should. With the silence of neighbors and the cruelty of the land itself, it is a story not just of one family, but of a people shaped by hardship and Secrecy, a story that still haunts the hills long after the last witness is gone and the cabin rotted back into the soil of the mountain. The story did not stop with Ruth's first child, for the mountains are not merciful. And time is relentless. Ruth's belly swelled again and again, and though each birth was shrouded in secrecy, the hollow knew what was happening, the women whispered over wash tubs, and the men muttered over their pipes, but still none spoke aloud to Eli, none dared, for he was not a man to challenge. His shoulders were broad, his fists calloused, and his eyes burned with a strange light as though he carried a truth no one else could see. He would stand in the doorway of his cabin watching the road, as if daring anyone to come and pass judgment. And so the neighbors stayed away. They told themselves it was not their business. They told themselves each family carried its own burdens and sins. But when the children grew old enough to be seen, when they stumbled barefoot out into the yard, pale and awkward, the neighbors could no longer look away. Children bore a look that made folks uneasy. Their eyes were too large, set too deep, their limbs thin and crooked, as though the bones themselves carried a flaw. Their voices were soft, strange, almost hollow, when they called to one another, and yet they were children all the same. They laughed when they left, splashed in the creek, they chased fireflies on summer nights. They clung to Ruth's skirts when strangers passed by. Ruth loved them with a fierce and light, silent devotion. She held them close, shielded them from the eyes of others, and when gossip grew too cruel, she drew them back into the cabin and shut the door. But no door could keep out the whisper of sign. No wall could muffle the mountain wind that carried the story from ridge to ridge, until even the farthest hollows had heard the preacher tried again to stir his flock, speaking of Sodom and the wrath that fell upon those who defied the laws of God. His voice thundered against the rafters of the little church, but still he did not name Eli. He spoke in parables, in warnings, in verses heavy with meaning. The congregation shifted in their seats, uneasy. Some glanced toward the back pew where Ruth sometimes sat, her head bowed, her hands folded on her lap. The children were never with her. Eli never set foot in the church again after Mary died, so Ruth alone bore the weight of those stairs, and when the sermon ended, she slipped out the door and down the path without raising her eyes. Some neighbors spoke of going to the law, but the law was far away. The sheriff rode the ridges only when called, and most folks believed troubles were best settled within the hollow. Besides, who would testify, who would stand before Eli and accuse him? The risk was too great, and the shame unbearable, so the silence thickened like fog in Ruth's children grew up in its shadow. As the years rolled on, the children became part of the land's strange folklore. They were seldom seen in daylight. They slipped through the woods like phantoms, gathering berries or carrying water, and some swore they never heard the children laugh outside the cabin yard. A hunter claimed he once crossed paths with them deep in the forest, and that their eyes glowed pale in the dusk like a wild animal's. Another woman said she saw them moving together in a line along the ridge, their heads bowed, as though driven by some force beyond their years. Perhaps it was all imagination. Perhaps it was the way guilt and fear twist the mind, but the hollow believed it, and the story grew. Ruth herself aged quickly. The burden of bearing children year after year hollowed her face and bent her back. Her hair streaked with gray before its time, and her eyes carried a haunted look. Yet those who caught glimpses of her said she still sang soft hymns as she worked. The garden still moved with a quiet grace that drew both pity and unease. Some said she was a victim, a lamb caught in a snare. Others said she was complicit, that she clung to Eli with a loyalty no decent daughter should hold. But all agreed she carried the weight of her family like a cross, and that she would carry it until her last breath. Meanwhile, grew harsher with age. He spoke little to outsiders, and when he did, his words were clipped like the crack of a branch underfoot. He was seen prowling the edge of his land, rifle in hand, daring any man to come near. The boys who had once roamed the hills grew into men and drifted away. Some said they joined the mines, some said they vanished into the wider world, never to return. Perhaps They fled the shame, perhaps they feared their father, or perhaps they carried the story with them, spreading it beyond the hollow. Whatever the truth, it was Ruth and Wasu, Eli, and the strange brood of children who remained in that lonely cabin under the shadow of the ridge. Was around that time that tragedy struck again. A fever swept through the hollow, a fever that burned in the lungs and left children gasping for air. Families lost sons and daughters to it, and Ruth's cabin was not spared. One of her youngest children, a boy pale and thin, was seen coughing on the porch one evening, and by dawn he was gone. The neighbors said they heard Ruth's wail carry through the trees, a sound so raw it froze the blood, but Eli was silent as ever. He dug the grave himself on the edge of the clearing and laid the child in the ground without a prayer. No preacher was called. No hymn was sung, only the sound of earth falling heavy on the small wooden box. Afterward, Ruth moved like a ghost through the days, her face hollow, her song stilled, but before long her belly swelled once more, and the cycle began again. Was this endless cycle that hardened the story into legend? The daughter who bore her father's children again and again, the children who lived in shadow, the man who ruled over them like a dark king in his crumbling cabin. Folks from other hollows came just to pass by the place, to peer from the road and whisper of the sin that dwelled there. Some claim the land itself began to sicken. The crops nearest the cabin withered, the animals grew thin, the creek water turned bitter. Of course, these were only tales born of fear and disgust. But in the mountains, tales have a way of taking root until they feel more solid than fact-hand. So Ruth's name became a warning. The old women told it to their daughters at night when the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin. Walls, they said, beware the silence, beware the loneliness that can twist blood into chains. They said, remember Ruth, the most sinister daughter who carried her father's seed and bore his children. They said, the mountains remember, and the mountains never forgive. Yet within all that horror there lingered a strange sorrow, for when people spoke of Ruth, some lowered their voices not in scorn but in pity. They saw not only the sin but the suffering. They saw a woman bound by duty and fear, by the harsh hand of a father and the harsher hand of the land. They saw children who had never known a life beyond the hollow, who had been born into secrecy and shame without any choice. And so the story carried not only the weight of condemnation, but also the ache of compassion, for the mountains are full of hard truths, and one of the hardest is that good and evil often walk side by side in the same cabin. The tale spread far beyond the hollow, carried on the tongues of travelers and traders, until it became part of Appalachian folklore, told in whispers by campfires, told in warnings from pulpits, told in stories printed by outsiders who came seeking the strange and the sinful. Each retelling shaped it anew. Some painted Ruth as a victim, some as a temptress, some as a ghost who still roams the ridges. But at the heart of every version was the same grim truth, a daughter bound to her father in a way no daughter should ever be beyond. Even as the years passed and the cabin fell into ruin, and the names of Eli and Ruth faded from living memory, the story endured, for the mountains hold tight to their tales, especially the dark ones. They press them deep into the soil, into the rocks, into the breath of the wind, so that long after the people are gone, the story still lingers, waiting to be told again. As the years rolled across the mountains and the seasons turned with the steady rhythm of rain and snow and new growth, the tale of Ruth and Eli began to outgrow the hollow that first birthed it. It drifted outward, carried on the tongues of men who worked the timber camps and women who traveled to markets in the valley. It traveled with miners who moved from camp to camp, seeking wages, with preachers who rode the circuit from one clapboard church to another. Even those who never saw the cabin or the strange children could repeat the story in fragments and whispers, and with each telling it grew a little larger, a little darker, until it became less the story of two people and more the shadow of the mountains themselves. The old ones who had lived near the cabin spoke in low voices, remembering details that outsiders craved. They told of Ruth's face, pale as milk, bent over her children with a love that seemed too fierce, too desperate They told of Eli's eyes, cold and bright. Watching every man who dared glance toward his daughter, they told of the way the children's laughter never rang right, how it sounded hollow, like wind through a broken flute. They told of the grave dug in silence for the boy taken by fever, and of Ruth's wail that carried over the ridge at night. These were the memories that gave the story its bones, but memories in the mountains never hold. Still, they shift and bend like branches in a storm by the time the tale reached the next county. Ruth was already half a ghost. Some said she had died in childbirth and that her restless spirit haunted the cabin. Others said she had fled into the hills and lived in a cave, raising her strange children away from all eyes. Still others insisted she had been struck down by God himself, lightning splitting the roof of the cabin and fire consuming the sins within. Each version carried the same core, but each dressed it in new colors, and so the story multiplied like seeds scattered on the wind. The preachers loved the story, for it gave them a sermon that struck fear into every heart. They thundered of Eli's sin, of Ruth's shame, of this punishment that surely awaited such defilement. They held up the tale as proof that without God's light a family could turn into a pit of darkness. They used it to warn young women to remain pure and young men to keep their hands from cruelty. But not every telling was from the pulpit around firesides on winter nights. Fathers told it with a shake of the head, mothers told it with tears in their eyes, and children listened wide-eyed, imagining the pale shapes of Ruth's brood moving in the trees. Time passed, the truth slipped further from reach. The cabin fell into ruin, its roof sagging, its door torn from the hinges. Ivy crept over the stones of the chimney, and the forest swallowed what was left. Hunters passed by and swore they heard footsteps in the leaves, though no one was there. Travelers claimed they saw candlelight flickering in the window long after Eli was said to be dead. Boys dared one another to creep up to the clearing at night and scratch their names on the doorframe. They came running back wild-eyed, with tales of a woman's voice singing low and mournful, or the sight of small handprints pressed in the dust. Some believed, some scoffed, but the story clung tighter than any vine because the mountains wanted it that way. The mountains always kept the darkest tales alive. Meanwhile, outside the ridges, people who had never set foot in the hollow began to speak of Ruth as though she were a figure of myth. Folklorists traveling through Appalachia in the early years of the 20th century collected whispers of her tale, writing them in notebooks beside stories of witches and haints. They marveled at the cruelty and isolation that could birth such a story, and some even doubted it was ever true at all. To them, it was proof of the mountain's strangeness, a window into a world cut off from the progress of cities and railroads. They did not see Ruth as a woman of flesh and sorrow, but as a symbol, as a cautionary figure carved into the folklore of a wild land, and so her humanity blurred until she was as much legend as fact. But within the hollows, where the old ones remembered, the pain was real. They knew the soil where Eli's cabin once stood. They knew the faces of the children, however fleeting. They knew the sound of Ruth's hymn carried on the wind. For them, it was not a parable or a curiosity. It was a memory weighted with shame and silence and pity. It was a wound carved into the land that never healed completely. And though many kept quiet when outsiders came asking, there were always a few who told enough to keep the story alive. The strange thing about such tales is how they change with the telling. Some storytellers painted Ruth as pure innocence, a lamb sacrificed upon the altar of her father's cruelty. They said she had no choice, that she endured because she was trapped in a world too small to escape. In those tellings, Ruth became almost saintly, her suffering a mirror of every hardship mountain women had endured, from cruel husbands to endless childbearing, to lives confined by the walls of a cabin. Others, though cast Ruth in a darker light, they spoke of her as complicit, as bound to Eli, not just by force, but by a twisted devotion. They said she had turned her back on the wider world, chosen the sin, and embraced it. They made her into a temptress, a figure who had lured her father into wickedness. For every telling, there was another, and so Ruth's ghost walked in many forms through the hills. What never changed was the children. The children were always strange, always marked, always caught between pity and horror. Some stories said they died young, their bodies too weak to withstand the curse of their birth. Others said they lived long wandering the ridges with hollow eyes and crooked limbs, haunting the forest like shadows. Some tales, even, claimed their descendants still walk the mountains, blood carrying its own curse down through the generations. No one could prove such claims, but the possibility was enough to keep the whispers alive. Every pale child born in a hollow, every crooked back, every strange face was enough to stir the memory of Ruth's brood. So the story lived on, not because it was written in books, but because it was spoken in kitchens, in fields, in mines, and along creek banks. It became one of those stories that defined a place, that gave shape to the fears and sorrows of a people. For the mountains were full of isolation and poverty and hard choices, and Ruth's tale gathered all those truths into one dark parable. It said, this is what happens when hardship twists too far, when silence becomes complicity, when blood itself turns against the natural order. It was not just about Ruth and Eli anymore. It was about everyone who heard it, about the dangers that lurked in every cabin, every hollow, where the world narrowed too tightly and love became something darker in this way. Ruth became immortal, not through stone or scripture, but through the endless retelling of her sorrow. Her name might change in some tellings, her father's name forgotten or replaced, but the heart of the story always returned: the daughter, the father, the children, the silence of neighbors, the shame of a whole community. And in that retelling, generation after generation, the line between memory and myth was erased, until only the tale remained. Years turned into decades, and the people who had once known Ruth by name passed into the earth. The cabin fell silent, swallowed by vines and saplings, until only a leaning chimney marked where the fire once burned. The children, whether they lived or died, left little trace in the world beyond a few whispers, a few frightened claims of shapes seen in the woods. The hollow itself seemed to fold in upon the memory, burying it beneath layers of new births, new deaths, new labors in the fields. But memory is stubborn in the mountains. It seeps into the soil, into the stones, into the breath of wind moving through the trees, and it waited for Ruth's story to be called upon again by the middle of the 20th century, when roads cut deeper into the ridges and the outside world began to spill into Appalachia. Ruth's tale found new life among those who came searching. Outsiders arrived with notebooks and tape recorders, eager to collect the folklore of a people they believed to be untouched by modern times. They listened to stories of witches and wandering spirits, of jack-tales and ghost lights, and in the quiet between, they sometimes heard the darker tale, the one that locals still spoke only in whispers. Some old woman on a porch would lean close, her eyes clouded by years, and say, "I remember a girl named Ruth, who bore children by her own father." She would tell it low and halting, and when asked for details, she would shake her head and say best not to speak more. The outsiders scribbled it down, hungry for such strangeness. They printed it in journals. They repeated it in lecture halls. They shaped it into a symbol of mountain darkness, and so Ruth, the girl of flesh and grief, became something else entirely. She became a story to be studied, a curiosity to be dissected, but within the hollows where the tale was born, Ruth remained something heavier. She was still a warning told to daughters at night when the lamp flickered low. She was still a figure mothers recalled when teaching their children the dangers of silence. She was still the ghost some claimed to hear on the wind when the night fell quiet. A man walking the ridge one autumn dusk swore he heard singing soft and mournful drifting through the trees. He said it was a hymn, but the words were broken as though carried on a voice too weak to finish. A hunter in the valley below claimed he saw a pale figure moving among the trees, cradling something in her arms. When he called out, the figure vanished like smoke. Another neighbor, working his field at dusk, swore he saw small shapes moving in a line across the ridge, like children following their mother. Their heads were bowed, their steps too slow, too heavy for children's games. He left His plow where it stood and never worked that patch of field again. These stories fueled the legend. They gave Ruth's sorrow a second life, not just as a tale of sin, but as a ghost story, one that lingered in the bones of the land. Some said the strange brood of children were doomed to wander forever, caught between worlds because they were never meant to be. Some said Ruth herself was condemned to walk the ridge mourning what had been forced upon her. Some even claimed Eli's spirit still prowled the hollow rifle in hand, guarding his cabin long after it rotted away. Whatever the form the story took, it always returned to the same truth that the land itself would not let go of the shame that had been sown into its hand. Yet, even as the story became a ghost tale, it carried with it a deeper meaning. For the old ones knew the mountains were full of sorrow, full of hardship that could twist lives into shapes no one wished to imagine. Ruth's story was not just about one girl and one man. It was about the dangers of isolation, about the way silence can rot a community, about the way poverty and pride can drive people into darkness. It was a story that carried warning and pity side by side, and perhaps that is why it endured so strongly, because it spoke not only of horror, but of the truths the mountains themselves whispered into every ear that listened. As the 20th century moved on and electricity lit the hollows and roads carried children away to cities, the tale of Ruth did not fade. It became part of the broader fabric of Appalachian folklore, spoken now, not just in whispers, but in books, in classrooms, in gatherings where old stories were shared. Some softened it, turning Ruth into a figure of pity alone. Others sharpened it, making her into a specter of sin and punishment. But in every telling, the image remained clear: the daughter bound to her father, the children who should never have been, the silence of neighbors who turned away, and the land that carried the weight of it all. Even today, when the hollows grow quieter, when the old cabins collapse and the young leave for places far away, Ruth's story remains. Ask the right old man at the right store or the right woman in the churchyard, and they will nod solemnly. They may not tell it in full, but they will acknowledge it with a look, with a wordless shake of the head, as though the shame still lingers. They will say, the mountains do not forget. They will say, Ruth still walks when the mist settles low. They will say, if you listen close on a summer night, you might hear children's laughter drifting thin and broken through the trees. And whether you believe it or not, you will feel a chill crawl up your spine, because the mountains have a way of making even disbelief tremble. In so Ruth lives on, not in stone or scripture, not in any proud monument, but in the living memory of a people who have carried sorrow for generations. She is the most sinister daughter, not because she chose to be, but because the world around her forced her into a place no daughter should ever stand. She is a symbol of silence and endurance, of cruelty and pity, of the thin line between truth and legend. She is the whisper carried by the wind across the ridges, the song half heard at dusk, the story told with lowered voices when the night is too long and the fire too dim, and long after every cabin has fallen and every witness has gone, Ruth will remain, for the mountains hold tight to their dead and tighter still to their stories.